Okay, so AI. It's everywhere, right? Like, seriously, everywhere. It's in those chatbots that are supposed to help us with customer service, but sometimes they just leave you more frustrated than when you started.
Oh, yeah.
And then there are those personalized ads, the ones that seem to know exactly what you were just thinking about buying. It's kind of creepy, but it's also kind of cool.
hmm It's all powered by AI.
It's even changing how we talk to each other, how we work, and how we engage with brands. But here's the thing. What if this technology that's supposed to be like totally objective and unbiased actually isn't?
That's the question we're diving into today. Welcome to our deep dive on AI bias in communication.
And we're basing this deep dive on a really insightful article by a French digital consultant who goes by the name W. Comsebo.
Great article. Really gets you thinking.
I was hooked from the first paragraph. It's like it gives you this whole new way of looking at all those weird or frustrating experiences we've all had with AI. You know, like when a chatbot just totally misses the point of what you're asking.
Oh, yeah. Happens to me all the time.
And that's why we're here. Think of this deep dive as your crash course in becoming like an AI bias detective. You'll learn how to spot those subtle ways AI can reflect, well, human prejudices. And you'll be able to look at those AI-powered interactions with a whole new level of understanding.
Because once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Exactly. So let's get down to basics. What exactly do we mean when we talk about AI bias in communication?
So in a nutshell, it's recognizing that AI systems, despite their fancy algorithms, can actually inherit and amplify the biases that already exist in the data they're trained on.
So it's like garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. If you train an AI on biased data, it's going to spit out biased results. And these biases can sneak into AI in all sorts of ways, often without us even realizing it.
And the article breaks down several types of bias, right? Each with its own little quirks and consequences.
Yep, and some of them are pretty sneaky.
One that really stood out to me was representation bias. It's like AI can be a bit of a, I don't know, digital snob, favoring certain groups over others.
It's less about snobbery and more about what the AI has and hasn't been exposed to in its training data. Like, imagine a customer service AI that was primarily trained on data from one specific demographic. It might have a really hard time understanding or responding accurately to someone from a different background.
Ah, okay. So like it's like trying to have a conversation with someone who's only ever read one book. Their perspective is going to be pretty limited.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And this lack of representation can have some serious consequences, potentially leading to everything from poor customer service to, well, to more systemic forms of discrimination.
And then there's confirmation bias, right? Where AI gets stuck in a bubble of its own making.
Oh, yeah. Confirmation bias is a tricky one. It's like the AI has already made up its mind and is only looking for information that confirms its pre-existing assumptions.
So it's kind of like those social media algorithms that keep showing you the same types of posts, even if you're trying to break out of your bubble.
Precisely. And that can be a real problem when it comes to things like news and information. You end up missing out on different perspectives, and you might even start to believe things that aren't true just because you're constantly being exposed to the same, like, skewed information.
It's kind of scary how easily that can happen.
Absolutely. Which is why it's so important to be aware of these biases and to actively seek out information from a variety of sources. Don't let the algorithms trap you in an echo chamber.
Okay, so we've got representation bias and confirmation bias. What's next?
Next up is algorithmic bias. This one's a bit more baked into the system.
Okay, so this isn't about the data itself, right?
Right, algorithmic bias is about the choices that are made by the people who create the algorithms, like how they decide what information is important, how they weight different variables, and even the very structure of the code itself.
So it's like the biases of the programmers can actually get translated into lines of code.
In a way, yeah. And that can have some huge consequences,
Yeah.
especially when you think about how much these algorithms are already impacting our lives. Like, imagine a social media platform that unintentionally prioritizes certain types of content over others.
Oh, I've seen that. It can feel like there's a digital gatekeeper deciding what I get to see.
Exactly. And that's why transparency and accountability are so crucial in the development of these algorithms.
Okay, so we've talked about representation bias, confirmation bias, and algorithmic bias. Is there anything else we need to be on the lookout for?
One more, and it's almost the opposite of algorithmic bias. It's called simplification bias.
Simplification, like keeping things simple. Isn't that a good thing?
Well, not always. Simplification bias is about AI's tendency to oversimplify things or reduce individuals to stereotypes for the sake of easier processing. It's all about fitting square pegs into round holes.
Oh, I see. So instead of seeing the nuances of a situation or the unique qualities of a person, the AI just lumps everything into neat little categories.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while that might seem efficient, it can lead to some pretty unfair outcomes.
So it's like that old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the dangers of relying too heavily on AI systems that are designed for speed and efficiency over, real understanding and nuance.
Wow, so these different types of bias can have a huge impact on how we communicate and interact with each other. But what can we actually do about it? I mean, this all feels pretty overwhelming.
Ugh, don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. There are some practical strategies for identifying and correcting these biases, and that's what we'll explore next.
All right, so we've uncovered these AI biases hiding in plain sight. But the big question is, how do we actually fight back? I mean, WRW ComSIBO lays out some pretty cool strategies, but how can we become more aware AI users? It's like we need a whole new skill set just to navigate the digital world.
You're right, it's not enough to just know these biases exist. We have to be active in shaping how AI is used and developed, and a big part of that is knowing how to spot and deal with these biases in real-world scenarios.
So we can't just hope the tech companies fix it for us. We actually have to do something.
Absolutely. We have to be super picky about the AI-driven information we consume. Don't just accept what's being given to you. Think critically, ask questions, and demand transparency. It's kind of like being a good journalist, always fact-checking and looking for potential bias.
Oh, I like that. So where do we even start? The article talks about data analysis and algorithmic audits, which sounds super technical. Do I need a computer science degree to understand this stuff?
You don't. Those methods are definitely important, but they're more for the developers, the ones actually building the AI. For us, regular folks, it's about training ourselves to see the red flags.
So what should we be looking for? What are some signs that an AI system might be fudging the facts?
One of the simplest things you can do is watch for patterns in how you interact with AI. Say you're using a chatbot, and it constantly misunderstands your questions or gives you answers that are totally irrelevant. That could be a sign of representation bias, especially if you're from a background that wasn't well represented in the AI's training.
Okay, so if the chatbot keeps asking me to repeat myself or gives me those generic responses that don't really help, that's a red flag.
Exactly. You got to look for those little inconsistencies, those miscommunications that might mean there's a bigger issue. And don't be shy about speaking up. Tell the company, report the problem, or even just use a different service if you feel like you're not being heard.
It's we got to use our collective voice as users to demand more fair and inclusive AI.
That's right. And never underestimate how powerful your individual actions can be. When enough people speak up, companies start listening.
So watching for patterns is a good place to start. What else can we do?
Another useful tool is feedback analysis. Those surveys they often give you after interacting with a chatbot. Those aren't just there for fun. Companies use that data to find areas where their AI needs improvement.
Oh, wow. So even if it's annoying, taking the time to fill out those surveys can actually help make the AI better for everyone.
Exactly. Your feedback tells the company how the AI is working in the real world. It's a way to directly shape how those systems are developed and improved. And the more specific you are, the better. If you see a specific example of bias, don't be afraid to call it out.
So it's we're beta testers for the future of AI.
I love that. We are, in a way. We're all part of this big experiment, and our feedback is super important for making sure AI moves in the right direction.
Okay, so we've got pattern recognition and feedback. Those are great starting points. But what about the super technical stuff like data analysis and algorithmic audits? Are those totally out of reach if you're not a tech whiz?
They're definitely more complex, but it doesn't mean you can't understand the basics.
Right.
Think of data analysis as peeking under the hood of an AI system to see what's powering it. Is the data it's trained on diverse and representative of the real world? Or is it biased towards certain groups? The more you know about where that data comes from and how it's being used, the easier it'll be to spot potential biases.
So even just having the right questions to ask can make a difference.
Absolutely. If you're curious about how an AI is being trained, just ask the company. A lot of companies are being more open about how they're building their AI and are happy to share information about their data sources.
It's all about transparency. That builds trust and helps us hold those companies accountable.
Exactly. And that brings us to algorithmic audits. Think of these like a more in-depth inspection of the AI's inner workings. Experts can analyze the code, look for patterns of bias in the algorithms, and spot places where the AI might be making unfair or discriminatory decisions.
It's like we need a whole team of AI bias detectives out there making sure these systems are playing by the rules.
The more people who know about these issues and how to identify them, the better. It's a team effort, and we all have a role to play.
Speaking of teams, the article also shows some really cool examples of how companies are actively trying to fix AI bias. So it's not all bad news.
No, definitely not. There's this growing movement towards what's called responsible AI, and we're seeing some really creative solutions popping up. One example that comes to mind is a company that completely redesigned its chatbot to be more inclusive of younger users.
Oh yeah, that was a good one. They realized their chatbot was using super formal language that teens wouldn't use, so they retrained it with data that included more slang and everyday language. Pretty cool, right?
It was. And it wasn't just about making the chatbot sound cooler. It was about understanding that language is a huge part of inclusion and that even small differences in how we communicate can create barriers.
It's like they gave the chatbot a personality makeover.
Exactly. And guess what? User engagement skyrocketed, and the company saw a big jump in customer satisfaction. It shows that taking an inclusive approach to AI isn't just the right thing to do. It can also be really good for business.
A win-win. It shows that companies are starting to understand that diversity and inclusion aren't just buzzwords. They're key to building AI that actually works for everyone.
Another really cool example is this streaming platform that realized their recommendations were mostly pushing Western media. To fix it, they went back and tweaked their algorithms to include more global diversity.
Oh, that's huge, but so important. I mean, it would be frustrating to only be recommended stuff that doesn't match your interests or background. It'd feel like being stuck in some kind of digital bubble.
Exactly. And by making the recommendations more diverse, they not only made things fairer for users, but they also opened up this whole new world of content that people might not have discovered otherwise.
It's like they used AI to connect different cultures instead of dividing them. That's the kind of impact I want to see.
And then there was a bank that found its customer service. AI was struggling to understand people who use local slang or expressions. Their solution was to create these language filters that could adapt to all those regional differences in speech.
That's awesome. It's like they taught their AI to speak multiple languages, even if those languages were just slightly different versions of the same one.
It's a perfect example of how paying attention to the nuances of communication and being committed to inclusion can make a big difference in how people experience AI. And it shows that the solutions don't have to be super complex or expensive.
Right.
Sometimes it's just about being mindful and making small but important adjustments.
It's clear there's a lot of good work being done towards building better AI. But what about that human element we talked about earlier? How do we make sure that even with all these technological advances, human judgment is still a priority?
That's such an important question because at the end of the day, AI is still just a tool and it needs to be guided and overseen by humans. We can't just unleash these systems and expect them to solve all our problems without any human involvement.
So it's like AI needs a chaperone, someone to make sure it doesn't get out of control.
That's a great way to put it. We need Hueys in the loop to watch for and correct potential biases, to make sure AI is being used ethically, and to make adjustments when needed.
It's like having a safety net to catch any mistakes before they turn into big problems.
Exactly. And that means investing in training and education for the people who are designing, implementing, and managing these AI systems. They need the knowledge and skills to recognize and minimize bias and to think critically about the ethical implications of their work.
So it's about building a culture of responsibility within companies that are developing and using AI, making sure everyone involved gets the importance of ethical AI and is committed to those standards.
Precisely. And that means having clear guidelines and policies in place, as well as ways to report and address concerns.
It's about making ethical AI development part of a company's core values and practices. It can't just be an afterthought.
Absolutely. And it's an ongoing process. As AI keeps changing, we have to keep adapting to make sure we're using it in a way that benefits all of humanity.
This has been such an insightful conversation. AI is such a powerful tool, and it has the potential to transform the world in so many ways, but it's up to us to ensure that transformation is positive.
I agree. It's not about rejecting AI altogether, but
Mhm.
understanding its limitations, recognizing its potential for bias, and actively shaping it to align with our values.
Yeah, it really does feel like we've been given this incredibly powerful tool, but like you said, we have to be careful with it because things could go wrong.
Right. It's not about being afraid of AI. It's more about understanding where it might fall short and recognizing those potential biases so we can make sure it develops in a way that matches our values.
And it's amazing to see so many people and organizations already doing that. We've talked about some really inspiring examples of companies trying to fix AI bias. But what about us? Like, what can our listeners do to be more aware and informed AI users?
I love that question. And it brings us right back to the heart of our deep dive. It's not enough to just understand these concepts in our heads. We have to actually use them in our daily lives. Think back to a time when you interacted with an AI system. Maybe it was a chatbot on a shopping site or a social media algorithm deciding what shows up on your feed.
Or even just something like Spotify recommending new music.
Exactly. We rely on AI so much without even realizing it. So as you think about that AI encounter, ask yourself, was there anything that felt a bit strange? Did the AI seem to miss what you were saying or make assumptions about what you liked? Did it try to push you towards certain options?
It's like we're all AI detectives in our own lives, looking for those little clues that might point to bias.
I love that analogy. And if you do notice something that feels off, don't just ignore it. Think about what kind of bias might be at play. Could it be representation bias, confirmation bias, algorithmic bias, simplification bias?
Even if we can't figure out exactly what kind of bias it is, just noticing those moments when things feel wrong is huge, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about developing that sense of awareness and questioning those systems that feel neutral but actually shape so much of our digital lives.
Okay, so let's say someone's identified potential bias. What can they actually do about it? It feels kind of like fighting a losing battle. How can one person make a difference against these massive tech companies?
Remember, even the biggest giants have weaknesses. Every voice counts, and even small actions can create change. If you're using a system that feels biased, let the company know. Report the issue, leave a review, or even just choose to use a different service that's more aligned with your values.
It's about making conscious choices as consumers and supporting the companies that are doing the right thing.
Exactly. And don't forget the power of conversation. Talk to your friends and family about these issues. The more we raise awareness and share knowledge, the more we can push for change together.
It's about creating a movement for responsible AI, one conversation at a time.
And that's really the core message of our conversation today.
Yeah.
AI isn't some far-off fantasy anymore. It's here. It's now. And it's changing our world in a major way. But the future of AI isn't set in stone. We're all actively shaping it through our choices, our actions, and our demands for ethical systems.
This deep dive has been so insightful, and we really appreciate WWComSibo for such a thought-provoking article. It's given us a new way of understanding this complex issue and empowered us to be more conscious and critical AI users.
It's been fantastic exploring these ideas with you. And to our listener, remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about AI bias, the better you'll be able to navigate this ever-changing tech landscape and create a future where AI truly benefits everyone.
And on that note, it's time to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration of the ideas that are shaping our world. Thanks for listening.